Now, before I start this impactful story, let me tell you a truth. If you don't subscribe now, you simply won't see the ending, and you'll also miss the stories that are coming, and they're even deeper, more emotional, and even more surprising. So do this. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, and comment the city you're watching from. I can't wait to share everything with you. The fluorescent lights of Meridian Corporate Solutions buzzed overhead as 58-year-old Magdalena Walsh adjusted her reading glasses and reviewed the quarterly reports one final time. The rain pelted against the windows of the downtown Chicago office building, creating rivulets that distorted the view of Lake Michigan in the distance. She had no idea that this dreary Tuesday afternoon would mark the end of 15 years of unwavering dedication to a company that had become more than just her workplace. It had become her second home. Don't miss a thing. Subscribe now and discover the ending of this and other thrilling and dramatic stories. What you're about to witness is a tale of corporate betrayal, family loyalty, and sweet revenge that will leave you absolutely speechless. This story has an ending so incredible, so satisfying, that you won't want to miss a single moment. Trust me, you'll want to be subscribed to catch every twist and turn of what's coming next. Magdalena had started at Meridian fresh out of a difficult divorce, desperate for stability and purpose. At 43, with her children Alexander and Amelia still in high school, she had thrown herself into the work with a determination that impressed even the most cynical managers. She started as a junior administrative assistant, but her keen eye for detail, her ability to anticipate problems before they occurred, and her natural leadership skills had propelled her through the ranks. Over the years, she had become the backbone of the operations department, the person everyone turned to when things went wrong, the steady presence that kept the entire floor running smoothly. Her colleagues respected her deeply. The younger employees sought her mentorship, and even the senior executives relied on her institutional knowledge. Magdalena knew every client's preferences, every vendor's quirks, every system's vulnerabilities. She had trained dozens of new hires, covered for sick colleagues countless times, and worked weekends without complaint when deadlines loomed. The walls of her cubicle were adorned with thank you cards from grateful co-workers, photos of company events where she was always at the center of the group, smiling warmly, and commendations from satisfied clients who specifically requested to work with her. But corporate culture was changing, and Magdalena could feel the shift in the air like the approaching storm clouds outside. The new CEO, 34-year-old Tobias Hartwell, had arrived 6 months earlier with his MBA from Wharton and his talk of disruption and synergistic optimization. He wore expensive suits that probably cost more than Magdalena's monthly salary, spoke in buzzwords that made her head spin, and had the kind of confidence that only came from never having experienced real failure. His eyes were cold blue, calculating, and they seemed to look right through people he deemed irrelevant to his vision. The layoffs had started gradually. First, it was the older security guard who had worked nights for 12 years. "We're me. Outsourcing security services for efficiency," Tobias had announced. Then it was Patricia from accounting, who at 62 had been deemed redundant despite her encyclopedic knowledge of the company's financial history. One by one, employees over 50 began disappearing, their desks cleared out overnight, their years of service reduced to brief mentions in company newsletters. Magdalena told herself she was different. She was indispensable. She was the operations manager, for heaven's sake. The department couldn't function without her. But as she sat in her cubicle that Tuesday afternoon, watching the rain streak down the windows, she couldn't shake the growing dread that had been building in her chest for weeks. "Magdalena, Mr. Hartwell wants to see you in his office." The voice belonged to Jessica, Tobias's 26-year-old assistant, whose main qualifications seemed to be her ability to take orders without question, and her talent for delivering bad news with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Magdalena's heart skipped a beat. In 6 months, Tobias had never called her to his office for a one-on-one meeting. Their interactions had been limited to department meetings where he spoke and everyone else listened, nodding at appropriate intervals. She gathered her notepad and pen, assuming he wanted to discuss the upcoming client presentations or perhaps the new efficiency protocols his consultants had been pushing. The executive floor felt different from the rest of the building. The carpet was thicker, the lighting warmer, the air somehow cleaner. Tobias's corner office commanded a spectacular view of the Chicago skyline, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made Magdalena feel small and exposed as she entered. He didn't look up from his laptop immediately, leaving her standing awkwardly by the door until he finally acknowledged her presence with a gesture toward the chair across from his massive mahogany desk. "Magdalena, thank you for coming up." His voice was smooth, practiced, the tone of someone who had delivered this speech before. "Please, sit down." She settled into the leather chair, clutching her notepad. "Of course, Mr. Hartwell. What can I help you with today?" Tobias closed his laptop with a soft click and leaned back in his chair, studying her with those cold blue eyes. "How long have you been with Meridian?" 15 years next month, she replied, pride creeping into her voice despite her nervousness. "It'll be 15 years on the 23rd. 15 years, he repeated, as if testing how the words sounded. "That's quite a long time in today's business environment. The world has changed dramatically since you started here." Magdalena nodded uncertainly. "Yes, sir. I've tried to adapt to all the changes, learn the new systems, implement the efficiency improvements." "Oh, I'm sure you have." He opened a file folder on his desk. "Your performance reviews have been consistently positive. Your colleagues speak highly of your work ethic. You're clearly dedicated." The word "but" hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Magdalena could feel it coming, could see it in the way his expression shifted from neutral to something that might have been pity if he were capable of genuine emotion. "But the reality is, Magdalena, that we're moving in a different direction. We need fresh perspectives, innovative thinking, people who understand the digital landscape and can help us compete in the modern marketplace. Already subscribed? Leave a like and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know where our audience comes from. Because what happens next will shock you to your core, and you'll want to share this incredible journey with others who appreciate stories of justice served cold." The words hit her like physical blows. I don't understand. My department's productivity is up 18% this quarter. The client satisfaction scores are impressive," Tobias interrupted smoothly. "And we appreciate everything you've contributed to the company. But frankly, at 58, you represent the old way of doing things. We need people who can grow with us, who have decades ahead of them to invest in Meridian's future." Magdalena felt the blood drain from her face. Are you saying I'm too old?" "I'm saying you're not the right fit for where we're heading." He pushed a folder across the desk toward her. "We're making this transition as easy as possible. Severance package, Cobra continuation, strong references. You'll land on your feet." She stared at the folder without touching it. 15 years of her life reduced to a manila envelope. "Mr. Hartwell, please. This job means everything to me. I've given you my best years. I've trained half the people in operations. I know this business inside and out." Which is exactly the problem. His tone remained maddeningly calm, professional. "You know the old business. We're building something new. Give me a chance," she pleaded, hating the desperation in her own voice. "Let me prove that I can adapt. I'll take training courses, learn whatever new systems you want to implement. I just need—" "Magdalena." He held up a hand to stop her. "The decision has been made. I'm sorry, but it's final." The word "sorry" from his lips was meaningless, a courtesy extended without sincerity. Magdalena sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing the reality that her world was crumbling around her. The reports she'd been reviewing an hour ago suddenly seemed insignificant. The colleagues she'd worked alongside for over a decade would continue their routines tomorrow without her. The corner cubicle that had become her sanctuary would be cleared out and assigned to someone younger, someone who fit Tobias's vision of the future. When? The word came out as barely a whisper, effective immediately. He was already reaching for his laptop, the conversation clearly over in his mind. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Jessica will handle the paperwork. Magdalena stood on unsteady legs, leaving the folder untouched on his desk. She had so many things she wanted to say, so many arguments she wanted to make, but the words died in her throat. What was the point? He had already decided she was disposable, a relic from a bygone era that had no place in his sleek, modern vision. 15 years, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. I know, Tobias replied, not looking up from his laptop screen. Thank you for your service. The walk from his office to the elevator felt like a death march. Other employees glanced her way, some with sympathy in their eyes as if they could sense what had just happened, others too absorbed in their own work to notice. The security guard who escorted her was gentle but firm, clearly uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. He waited patiently while she packed her personal items into a cardboard box. The framed photos of Alexander and Amelia at their graduations, the small potted plant she'd nurtured for 5 years, the coffee mug that said, "World's Best Mom," that her children had given her for Mother's Day, the collection of thank you notes from appreciative colleagues and clients. Her co-workers watched in silent shock as she made her way to the elevator with her box of memories. Paula from Human Resources looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Marcus from IT started to approach her, probably to say goodbye, but the security guard subtly shook his head. No time for goodbyes. No ceremony for a decade and a half of dedication. The elevator ride down to the lobby was the longest 30 seconds of Magdalena's life. She stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors, seeing a tired woman with graying hair and lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she started at Meridian. When had she gotten old? When had she become the kind of person that someone like Tobias could discard without a second thought? The October air outside was crisp and harsh, a preview of the bitter Chicago winter to come. Magdalena stood on the sidewalk outside the building that had been her second home, clutching her box of belongings and trying to process what had just happened. Office workers hurried past her, their faces buried in their phones, oblivious to the personal catastrophe unfolding on the busy downtown street. She managed to hold herself together for the ride home on the L train, sitting rigidly upright with her box on her lap, staring out the window at the passing neighborhoods. But the moment she stepped into her empty apartment in Lincoln Park, the modest 2-bedroom she'd been able to afford thanks to her steady job at Meridian, the dam broke. She set the box on her kitchen table and collapsed into a chair, sobbing with a force that surprised her. The tears weren't just for the job she'd lost. They were for the dignity that had been stripped away, for the years of loyalty that had been deemed worthless, for the future that had suddenly become uncertain and frightening. At 58, starting over felt impossible. Who would hire someone her age in today's market? How would she pay her mortgage, her insurance, all the bills that required the steady income she'd taken for granted? Just one click. Subscribe, leave a like, and say where you're watching from. Your support is essential for our growth. Because you absolutely cannot miss what's about to unfold. This story is about to take a turn that will restore your faith in karma and leave you cheering out loud. She cried until she had no tears left, until her eyes were swollen and her head pounded. Then she sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment, too drained to turn on the lights, too numb to think about dinner or any of the normal routines that had structured her days for so long. The silence was deafening after 15 years of busy office environments, ringing phones, and constant human interaction. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was Alexander, her 30-year-old son who lived in New York. "Hey, Mom. Just wanted to check in. How was your day?" How was her day? How could she possibly answer that question? Her son was successful, busy with his own life and career. He didn't need to be burdened with her problems. She typed back, "Fine, sweetheart. Just tired. How are you?" But Alexander wasn't fooled. He had inherited his mother's intuition, and something in her brief response set off alarm bells. Her phone rang almost immediately. "Mum, you don't sound fine." What's wrong? The concern in his voice nearly made her start crying again. Oh, Alexander. I lost my job today. What? What happened? I thought you were indispensable there. Apparently not. She told him the whole story, from the summons to Tobias's office to the humiliating escort from the building. Alexander listened without interrupting, but she could hear his breathing getting heavier, could sense his anger building. That bastard, he said finally. That absolute bastard. Mom, this is illegal. You can sue them for age discrimination. With what money? Magdalena laughed bitterly. Do you know how expensive lawyers are? And even if I could afford one, even if I won, it would take years. I need income now, not someday. Mom, listen to me. You're not alone in this. I'm doing well, really well. Let me help you. Alexander worked in finance in Manhattan, but Magdalena had never asked too many questions about the specifics. She knew he was successful. His apartment in Soho and his expensive clothes made that clear. But she had raised both her children to be independent, and she wasn't about to become a burden to them now. Absolutely not, she said firmly. You have your own life to live. I'll figure something out. Mom. No, Alexander. I appreciate the offer, I really do. But I've been taking care of myself for 15 years, and I'm not about to stop now. They talked for another hour, with Alexander offering increasingly creative solutions, and Magdalena rejecting each one with the stubborn pride that had carried her through her divorce and single motherhood. When they finally hung up, she felt slightly better. At least she wasn't completely alone. The next few days passed in a haze of job searching, unemployment paperwork, and the gradual adjustment to a life without structure. Magdalena attacked the job hunt with the same methodical approach she'd brought to everything at Meridian, creating spreadsheets to track applications, tailoring her resume for each position, and researching companies with the thoroughness of a private investigator. But the responses were discouraging. Companies that were supposedly desperate for experienced workers suddenly had no openings when they saw her in person. Interviews that seemed to go well resulted in rejection emails citing cultural fit or different direction. The few positions that were offered came with salaries so low they wouldn't cover her basic expenses. By Friday, reality was setting in. She was 58 years old in a job market that worshipped youth. She had skills and experience, but in a world that changed by the day, 15 years of expertise could be seen as 15 years of obsolescence. The thought of selling her apartment, of downsizing her entire life, began to creep into her mind during the long, sleepless nights. Meanwhile, back at Meridian Corporate Solutions, Tobias Hartwell was discovering what it meant to lose someone truly indispensable. The operations department, which had run like clockwork under Magdalena's guidance, began showing cracks almost immediately. Client complaints that she would have anticipated and prevented started piling up. Reports that she would have caught and corrected before they reached executive level were arriving on Tobias's desk riddled with errors. "Where's the Morrison account file?" Jessica asked Marcus in IT on Monday morning. "I don't know. Magdalena always handled that one." "Well, where did she keep it?" Marcus shrugged. "She had her own system. None of us really knew how she organized everything." The same conversation was happening throughout the office. Magdalena hadn't just done her job. She had been the institutional memory of the company, the keeper of countless small but crucial details that kept everything running smoothly. Her replacement, an eager 26-year-old named Connor with an MBA and no real-world experience, was drowning in responsibilities he didn't understand and systems he couldn't navigate. "Why didn't anyone document these processes?" Tobias demanded during an emergency department meeting on Wednesday. "Magdalena was working on that," Paula from HR replied. "It was going to be part of the Q4 efficiency initiatives. She was supposed to create training manuals for her replacement." "Was supposed to? What happened to that project?" Paula looked uncomfortable. "Well, sir, you let her go before she could finish." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room, though no one dared voice it aloud. In his rush to modernize and eliminate what he saw as dead weight, Tobias had cut out the very foundation that kept his operation stable. But admitting that would mean acknowledging a mistake, and Tobias Hartwell didn't make mistakes. Other people failed to execute his vision properly. Back in her Lincoln Park apartment, Magdalena was having her own struggles with the aftermath of her dismissal. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a deep, simmering anger that surprised her with its intensity. She had never been a vengeful person, had always believed in taking the high road, in turning the other cheek. But lying awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling and worrying about her future, she found herself fantasizing about Tobias Hartwell's downfall. She imagined him failing. Spectacularly, his arrogance finally catching up with him. She pictured herself somehow vindicated, proven right, with him forced to acknowledge that he had made a terrible mistake. The fantasies were petty and unlike her, but they provided a small comfort in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come. On Sunday evening, a week after her dismissal, Alexander called again. This time, his voice carried a strange undertone that she couldn't quite identify. Excitement mixed with something that sounded almost like mischief. "Mom, I've been thinking about what happened to you. About that company and that CEO who treated you so badly. Alexander, please don't tell me you're planning to do something foolish. I don't want you getting involved in this." "Actually, I've been doing some research. Meridian Corporate Solutions. It's a mid-sized firm, right? About 200 employees, 30 million in annual revenue." Magdalena frowned. "How do you know their revenue figures?" "It's public information, if you know where to look." "Mom, can I ask you something? In all your years there, did you ever see their corporate structure? Do you know who owns the company?" "Well, it's privately held. There are shareholders, but I never paid attention to that side of things. That was way above my pay grade." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "Mom, what if I told you that there might be a way to get justice? Not just for you, but for all the older employees they've been pushing out." "Alexander, what are you talking about? Just trust me, okay? I'm working on something. Don't make any major decisions about your future just yet. Give me a week." "A week for what?" But he had already hung up, leaving Magdalena staring at her phone in confusion. She knew that tone in her son's voice. He was up to something. Alexander had always been the more impulsive of her two children, the one who jumped first and asked questions later. It had gotten him into trouble as a child, but it had also led to some of his greatest successes as an adult. The following week dragged by with agonizing slowness. Magdalena continued her job search, but her heart wasn't really in it. Alexander's mysterious phone call had planted a seed of hope that she was afraid to water, terrified that whatever he was planning would backfire and make her situation worse. She had learned not to count on miracles. Meanwhile, at Meridian, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. 2 major clients had already complained about service issues. The Morrison account that Jessica had asked about was in chaos after Connor sent the wrong quarterly projections to the client, nearly costing them $1 million contract. The efficiency metrics that Tobias prized so highly were plummeting as employees struggled to cover for the institutional knowledge that had walked out the door with Magdalena. "We need to hire someone with more experience for the operations manager position," Paula suggested during a staff meeting on Friday. "No," Tobias replied firmly. "Connor just needs time to settle in. We're not going backward." But privately, he was beginning to wonder if he had moved too fast. Not that he would ever admit it. Admitting error was a sign of weakness, and weakness had no place in his vision of corporate leadership. Instead, he doubled down, pushing his remaining employees harder, demanding longer hours and higher productivity to compensate for the disruptions. The final straw came on Monday morning when the Templeton Group, Meridian's largest client, called an emergency meeting. Sarah Templeton herself, the CEO of the family-owned manufacturing company that accounted for nearly 30% of Meridian's revenue, was flying in from Detroit to address what she called serious concerns about service quality. Tobias prepared for the meeting with his usual confidence, armed with charts and graphs that showed improvements in various metrics. He was certain he could smooth over whatever minor issues had upset the client. After all, He was Tobias Hartwell. He had turned around 3 companies in the past decade. One disgruntled client was hardly cause for panic. Sarah Templeton arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, accompanied by her CFO and her head of operations. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Tobias had met her only once before, shortly after his appointment as CEO, and she had struck him then as old-fashioned and resistant to change, exactly the kind of client that Meridian needed to evolve beyond. "Mr. Hartwell," she said without preamble as they settled into the conference room, "we have a problem. I'm sure whatever issues you're experiencing can be resolved quickly," Tobias replied smoothly. "We've been implementing some exciting new protocols that will ultimately improve our service delivery significantly. Your new protocols have nearly cost us 2 major contracts," Sarah replied coldly. "The quarterly report your people sent us last week contained projections that were off by 40%. Our CFO spent 3 days trying to reconcile numbers that made no sense before we realized the error was on your end." Tobias felt a flutter of anxiety but maintained his composure. "I apologize for that isolated incident. Connor, our new operations manager, is still learning our systems. I assure you it won't happen again." "Connor?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "What happened to Magdalena Walsh?" The question caught Tobias off guard. "Ms. Walsh is no longer with the company. We felt it was time for fresh leadership in operations." "Fresh leadership?" Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet. "Mr. Hartwell, Magdalena Walsh was the best operations manager we've ever worked with. She knew our business inside and out, anticipated our needs before we even realized them ourselves. She was the primary reason we stayed with Meridian through 3 CEO changes. I understand your attachment to familiar faces," Tobias began. "But in today's business environment," Sarah interrupted, "competence matters more than age. Experience matters more than buzzwords. Results matter more than whatever consulting firm told you to gut your workforce of anyone over 50. The meeting went downhill from there. Despite Tobias's best efforts to redirect the conversation, Sarah made it clear that the Templeton Group was reconsidering their relationship with Meridian. They would honor their current contracts, but were actively seeking alternative service providers for future business. As the Templeton delegation left, Tobias felt the first real cracks in his confidence. Losing the Templeton account would be catastrophic, both financially and in terms of Meridian's reputation in the industry. But he still wasn't ready to admit that firing Magdalena had been a mistake. There had to be another solution, another way to resolve the crisis without acknowledging error. That evening, as Tobias sat in his corner office staring out at the Chicago skyline, he didn't notice the sleek black town car pulling up to the building's main entrance. He didn't see the well-dressed man in an expensive suit step out and speak briefly to the security guard. He was too absorbed in his own thoughts, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation without sacrificing his pride. The man who entered the building was tall and confident, with the kind of presence that made people take notice. He moved through the lobby with purpose, signed in at the security desk, and took the elevator to the executive floor. When he knocked on Tobias's office door at 8:30 that evening, the CEO looked up in surprise. "I'm sorry, but the office is closed," Tobias said. "If you need to schedule an appointment." "I don't think an appointment will be necessary," the man replied, stepping into the office without invitation. "My name is Alexander Walsh. I believe we need to talk." The name hit Tobias like a physical blow. Walsh. Magdalena Walsh. This had to be related to his fired operations manager, but he couldn't figure out the connection. The man was young, maybe 30, impeccably dressed in what looked like a custom suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Tobias said carefully. "What is this concerning?" Alexander smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's concerning the future of this company, Mr. Hartwell. And more specifically, your role in it." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on Tobias's desk with deliberate precision. "I represent a group of investors who have been watching Meridian Corporate Solutions with great interest. We've been particularly interested in how the company has been managed lately. Tobias felt his mouth go dry. I'm sorry, but if you're interested in investment opportunities, you'll need to go through proper channels. Meridian is privately held, and we're not currently seeking additional investors. Oh, but you see, that's where you're wrong. Alexander opened the folder and pulled out a series of documents. We've been acquiring shares from existing stakeholders for several months now. Quietly, discreetly, but quite legally. The blood drained from Tobias's face as he scanned the documents. Purchase agreements, transfer documents, SEC filings, all showing the systematic acquisition of Meridian shares by something called Walsh Holdings, LLC. I don't understand, Tobias whispered. This is impossible. Is it? Alexander pulled out another document. As of close of business today, Walsh Holdings controls 51% of Meridian Corporate Solutions, which makes me, as the majority owner, very interested in how this company is being run. Tobias stared at the papers, his mind reeling. Walsh Holdings. You're related to? Magdalena Walsh is my mother, Alexander said quietly. The woman you fired last week for. Being too old is my mother. The woman whose 15 years of dedication meant nothing to you is my mother. The room felt like it was spinning. Tobias gripped the edge of his desk, trying to process what was happening. This has to be some kind of mistake. The shareholders, the board. The shareholders were very happy to sell to a legitimate buyer offering above market prices, Alexander explained calmly. Especially when that buyer had done his homework and could demonstrate that the current management was driving away major clients through incompetence. The Templeton Group, Tobias breathed. Among others, yes, I spoke with Sarah Templeton. Lovely woman. She was quite concerned about the direction Meridian was heading. In fact, she was instrumental in helping me understand exactly how valuable my mother was to this operation. Alexander stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. You know what's interesting, Mr. Hartwell? I started looking into this company as soon as my mother told me what happened. I wanted to understand how a business could be so short-sighted as to throw away someone with her skills and experience. He turned back to face Tobias, who was still staring at the documents in shock. What I found was fascinating. A CEO with no real operational experience, brought in to modernize a company that was already running efficiently. A systematic purge of experienced employees in favor of younger, cheaper workers. A leadership style that prioritized image over substance. This is corporate harassment, Tobias managed to say. I'll call my lawyers, the board. The board answers to the majority shareholder now, Alexander said simply. And my lawyers are very, very good. Everything I've done is completely legal. Unlike your little campaign of age discrimination, which my legal team is documenting quite thoroughly. Tobias felt trapped, cornered like an animal. What do you want? Justice, Alexander replied. And change, starting with your resignation. I won't resign. You can't make me. Alexander smiled again, that cold, calculating expression that reminded Tobias uncomfortably of his own reflection. Actually, I can. As majority owner, I have the authority to remove the CEO for cause. And I have plenty of cause. Declining client satisfaction, deteriorating operational efficiency, potential legal liability from discriminatory hiring practices, and gross mismanagement of human resources. He pulled another document from his briefcase. Of course, I'd prefer to handle this professionally. Your resignation, effective immediately, with a standard severance package and a confidentiality agreement. Clean, simple, no messy public relations issues. And if I refuse? Then I call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning and present evidence of your failures to the shareholders. The Templeton situation alone would be enough to justify your removal, but I have documentation of several other client complaints, productivity declines, and staff morale issues directly traceable to your decisions. Tobias stared at the resignation letter, his hands shaking slightly. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was crumbling around him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being forced out just as he had forced out so many others. But unlike his victims, he couldn't claim discrimination or unfair treatment. This was purely business, purely about competence and results. "You're doing this for revenge," he said finally. "I'm doing this for justice," Alexander corrected. "There's a difference. My mother gave 15 years of her life to this company. She deserved better than a 5-minute dismissal from someone who couldn't see past his own prejudices." The office fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on Tobias's desk. Outside, the city continued its evening routines, oblivious to the corporate drama unfolding in the tower above. Finally, Tobias reached for his pen. "What happens to me after I sign this?" "You take your severance, sign your confidentiality agreement, and start over somewhere else," Alexander replied. "Just like my mother had to do. The only difference is that you're 34 years old. You have time to learn from your mistakes." Tobias signed the resignation letter with a hand that trembled only slightly. As he set down the pen, he felt a strange mixture of relief and humiliation. The weight of recent failures had been crushing him, even if he hadn't been willing to admit it. Part of him was almost grateful to have the burden removed, even under these circumstances. "There's one more thing," Alexander said as he collected the signed documents. "The board meeting tomorrow will include a discussion of new leadership for the company. I'll be recommending someone for the operations manager position, someone with extensive experience and institutional knowledge." Tobias's eyes widened in understanding. "You're bringing her back." "I'm bringing her back," Alexander confirmed, "as an interim operations manager with full authority to restructure the department and restore the standards that made Meridian successful." The next morning, Magdalena Walsh stood in the lobby of the Meridian building, wearing her best suit and carrying a new briefcase that Alexander had insisted on buying for her. She felt like she was living in a dream, or perhaps a very satisfying nightmare. 24 hours. Earlier, she had been a discarded employee worrying about her future. Now she was walking back into the building as the interim operations manager, with her son as the majority owner of the company. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt very different from her last trip up here. This time she was going to Tobias's former office, now her temporary office, to meet with the department heads and begin the process of rebuilding what had been torn down. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was, now sitting where Tobias had delivered his crushing verdict just days earlier. The reactions of her former colleagues ranged from shock to delight to barely concealed glee. Marcus from IT actually applauded when she walked onto the operations floor. Paula from HR looked like she might cry with relief. Even Connor, the young man who had replaced her, seemed grateful for the rescue from responsibilities he had never been prepared to handle. "I want to be clear about something," Magdalena addressed the assembled staff at an impromptu meeting. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm not here to settle scores or make anyone's life difficult. I'm here to do what I've always done. Make sure this department runs efficiently and serves our clients well." But there was steel in her voice that hadn't been there before. A confidence born from surviving the worst that corporate America could throw at her and emerging victorious. She had learned that loyalty wasn't always rewarded, that experience wasn't always valued, but that justice sometimes wore unexpected faces. Over the following weeks, Magdalena worked systematically to repair the damage that had been done during her brief absence. She restored the processes that had been abandoned, rebuilt the client relationships that had been damaged, and retrained staff on the standards that had made Meridian's operations department renowned in their industry. The Templeton Group, impressed by the swift changes, agreed to continue their relationship with Meridian. Other clients who had been considering departures decided to give the company another chance. The operational metrics that had plummeted during Connor's brief tenure began climbing back toward their previous levels. Alexander, meanwhile, was proving to be as capable a business owner as he had been a son seeking justice for his mother. His background in finance gave him insights into operational efficiency that complemented Magdalena's practical experience perfectly. Together, they began implementing changes that went beyond simply restoring the status quo. They were improving systems, expanding services, and positioning Meridian for sustainable growth. "Mom," Alexander said one evening as they reviewed quarterly projections in her new corner office, the same office where Tobias had dismissed her weeks earlier. "I have a confession to make." Magdalena looked up from her computer screen. "What kind of confession?" "I didn't buy this company just to get revenge on that CEO. I mean, that was definitely part of it." He grinned sheepishly. "But I'd been looking for investment opportunities in Chicago for months. When you told me what happened, I decided to take a closer look at Meridian's financials. And I realized it was actually a really solid company with great fundamentals that was being run into the ground by incompetent leadership. Getting justice for you was personal, but buying the company was good business." Magdalena laughed, shaking her head in amazement. "So you're telling me that Tobias Hartwell's biggest mistake wasn't just firing me. It was proving to a potential investor that he didn't know how to run the company?" "Exactly. If he had been competent, I never would have been able to acquire a controlling interest at such a reasonable price." His failures made the shareholders eager to sell. 6 months later, Magdalena was no longer the interim operations manager. She had been promoted to chief operating officer, a position that had never existed at Meridian before, but which Alexander had created specifically to recognize her expanded role in the company's revival. The 26-year-old MBA who had replaced her as operations manager worked under her guidance, learning from her experience while bringing fresh perspectives to traditional challenges. The company's transformation was remarkable. Revenue was up 30% from the previous year. Client retention had improved dramatically. Employee satisfaction scores, which had plummeted during the months of uncertainty under Tobias's leadership, were now at all-time highs. Magdalena had implemented mentorship programs that paired experienced employees with younger staff, creating knowledge transfer systems that would prevent the kind of institutional memory loss that had nearly crippled the operations department. As for Tobias Hartwell, he had landed a position at a smaller consulting firm in Milwaukee, where his experience was valued despite the circumstances of his departure from Meridian. The confidentiality agreement prevented him from discussing the details of his exit, but industry gossip eventually filled in the gaps. He had learned, perhaps too late, that dismissing experienced employees as too old was not just morally wrong but strategically disastrous. 1 year after her dismissal, Magdalena stood in the same conference room where Sarah Templeton had delivered her ultimatum to Tobias. This time, however, the Templeton Group was there to sign an expanded service contract that would make them Meridian's largest client by far. "Magdalena," Sarah said as they concluded the meeting, "I have to tell you how impressed we've been with the changes here. This is the Meridian we remember from years past, but better." "Thank you, Sarah. It means a lot coming from you. Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah's voice dropped to a more intimate tone. "How did you manage to turn this situation around so completely? A year ago, you were out of work and facing age discrimination. Now, you're running the show." Magdalena smiled, thinking of all the sleepless nights, the moments of despair, the anger that had motivated her to keep fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. "I had help," she said simply. "And I learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can turn out to be the best thing if you're willing to see the possibilities. Your son's involvement wasn't just luck, though, was it? He saw something in this company that made it worth investing in. Alexander always said I taught him to recognize value, even when it's not immediately apparent. I guess he learned that lesson better than I realized." As the Templeton delegation left, Magdalena remained in the conference room for a few moments, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The same view that had intimidated her during her humiliating dismissal now filled her with satisfaction and hope. She had not only survived the worst betrayal of her professional life, she had transformed it into the greatest opportunity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amelia, her daughter, who was finishing her residency in pediatrics in Boston. "Saw the article about Meridian in the Business Journal. So proud of you, Mom. You're an inspiration." The article had been a profile of successful corporate turnarounds, featuring Meridian as an example of how companies could revitalize themselves through better leadership and employee retention. Magdalena's story was presented as a case study in the value of institutional knowledge and the dangers of age-based discrimination in the workplace. That evening, Alexander stopped by her office as she was preparing to leave. "Mom, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "When I first started buying shares in this company, I thought I was doing it for you, to get justice, to prove a point about how badly they had treated you. And now I realize you didn't need rescuing. You would have landed on your feet regardless of what I did. You always have." Magdalena considered this. "Maybe, but I have to admit, having backup made all the difference. Knowing that someone believed in me, someone was willing to fight for me. That gave me strength I didn't know I had. Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad it worked out this way. Not just because of the justice angle, but because this has been the best investment I've ever made, financial and personal." As they walked to the elevator together, Magdalena reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she had been a dedicated employee who took orders and followed protocols. Today, she was a leader who set strategy and made decisions that affected hundreds of people. The transformation hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when she wondered if she was capable of rising to the challenge. But she had learned something important about herself in the process. Age wasn't about the number of years you'd lived. It was about whether you were still willing to grow, to adapt, to take on new challenges. At 59, she was more energized and engaged than she had been in years. The elevator arrived, and as the doors opened, Magdalena caught sight of her reflection in the polished steel. She saw a confident woman in an expensive suit, carrying herself with authority and purpose. It was the same face that had stared back at her in defeated shock a year earlier, but everything else had changed. "You know what the best part is?" she said to Alexander as they descended toward the lobby. "What's that?" "Tobias Hartwell taught me something I never would have learned otherwise. He showed me that being comfortable, being secure, being loyal to a company that doesn't value you, that's not success. That's just survival. And what is success?" Magdalena smiled as the elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened onto the busy lobby where security guards nodded respectfully, and employees called out friendly greetings. Success is knowing your worth and making sure the world recognizes it too. As they stepped out into the Chicago evening, with the lights of the city reflecting off the windows of the Meridian building behind them, Magdalena Walsh felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in her future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever changes the business world might bring, she was ready. She had survived the worst betrayal and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The woman who had been dismissed as too old had not only proven her critics wrong, she had redefined what it meant to be experienced, valuable, and indispensable in the modern workplace. And somewhere in Milwaukee, in a smaller office with a less impressive view, Tobias Hartwell was learning to appreciate the wisdom that comes with age, one hard lesson at a time.